first begin talking about medicine for a moment and about the importance of medicine within the framework of Judaism. My bar mitzvah Torah portion, my bar mitzvah parsha, is the portion of Mishpatim, which is actually coming up in a few weeks, which, by the way, means birthday is coming up in a few weeks. So listen, we'll send you the link. Kidding. The link to the registry. I'm joking, but it's coming up in a few weeks, and that's the cycle. Mishpatim has an interesting law. It talks about damages. If somebody, God forbid, injures someone else, it talks about the liability that they have toward the other. And it says one of the things that they are on the hook to pay for are the medical bills. You have to pay for the medical bills, which our sages tell us means that the Torah is allowing physicians to heal. Are you with me? Because if it wouldn't be allowed to heal, what could the Torah say to pay medical bills? What kind of medical bills? Why are you going to a doctor? By the way, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because in some ancient philosophies, maybe not so ancient, the idea is, listen, God is the healer. Let God do the healing. We don't need human being doctors. You probably know Judaism doesn't prescribe to that, doesn't or subscribe to that because of the Jewish doctors. But this is the source in Torah about the idea of the source of Torah for healing, about paying medical bills, that teaches us that a doctor is permitted to heal. But in addition to being permitted to heal, a doctor, moreover, has an obligation to heal. It's not just allowed, it's obligatory. We know, of course, the Torah tells us that if somebody's life is in danger, it is incumbent upon us, and that includes all of us who are capable of helping to save a life, to preserve life, to protect life in all of its forms and in all situations. And thus, doctors who stand at the forefront of protecting and preserving life are able to fulfill this most basic obligation of the Torah, which is to preserve life in the most incredible way. And it is truly, truly a marvel to me, who's not a doctor, to physicians who are literally standing at the front lines of bringing healing to the world, to individuals, and to our communities. So I want to thank all of the doctors who are here with us tonight. And that's by way of introduction. With medicine, like every science and wisdom, medicine is constantly evolving. And with its evolution comes many questions. New cases, new technologies, new sciences that beg the question, is it kosher or is it okay? When I say kosher, I don't mean literally kosher. I mean, is it halachically, is it from a Jewish legal perspective, is this okay? Just because we can do this treatment or we can create this technology, this medical technology, is it okay? Is it legal from a Jewish perspective? Is it ethical, right? We could talk about cloning and other sorts of wild concepts, and some of them we will talk about tonight. The question that comes to mind from a Jewish perspective, whenever we encounter new medical technologies and new medical sciences, is it okay? Is it allowed? Is it permitted? What are the Jewish considerations and parameters? We have with us tonight one of the world's leading authorities, Jewish medical ethics, Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman, who is, I'm going to read to you his bio soon, but I just want to share a few words that are not from the formal bio. I was first introduced by Dr. Reichman several years ago, with the JLI course, the first JLI course on medical ethics, which was called Medicine and Morals. There was another one which was called Life in the Balance. I know that some of you took those courses with me, some of you with perhaps some other JLI rabbis and affiliates. I was struck by the depth and the breadth and the brilliance of these courses, and I wanted to find out more. I had the pleasure of meeting Rabbi Dr. Reichman at one of the JLI retreats several years ago, and then most recently about a year and a half ago, and just was struck by the clarity, the brilliance of his wisdom, as well as the clarity of his presentation. We're talking about cutting edge topics in medicine, explained to the layperson in ways that are easy to understand, clear. You have a clear sense of what the issues are, and it's frankly dazzling. It's just astounding. So it's been a few years that I've wanted to bring down Rabbi Dr. Reichman to our community to speak. Of course, as things are right now, We're not doing this in person, but hopefully this is close to what we would have in person. And it's truly a pleasure and an honor that Rabbi Dr. Reichman has agreed to be with us here tonight. So I want to thank you, Rabbi Dr. Reichman, for being here. I want to thank all of you for participating in this really incredible evening. All right, without further ado, the introduction, and we're going to get right to the program. Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine and biomedical and bioethics research training at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He received his rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University and writes lectures widely in the field of Jewish medical ethics. He is the recipient of a Kornfeld Foundation Fellowship and the Rubinstein Prize in Medical Ethics, and is a member of both the board of the Halachic Organ Donor Society and the advisory board of the Institute for Genetics and Public Policy. His research is devoted to the interface of medical history and Jewish law. Rabbi Dr. Reichman was chief medical consultant for the JLI Medical Ethics course, Medicine and Morals, and associate editor of JLI's course, Life in the Balance, both, as I mentioned a moment ago, of which I've taught and enjoyed immensely. In addition, he is the chairman of the Jewish Medical Ethics Conference at the National Jewish Retreat. And folks, this is open really to anybody, but for doctors to get credits. Last year, there was no in-person retreat, but the Jewish Medical Ethics Conference at the National Jewish Retreat is incredible. I encourage everyone to participate. Rabbi Dr. Reichman, maybe you'll speak about that at the end for a minute or two, about that concept and about what it entails. But folks, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm, not social, real welcome to Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman.
For you guys, thank you so much, Rabbi. Tremendously appreciate the opportunity to join you. A real pleasure to join you guys. A lot has happened in the world since Rabbi, you and I saw each other. We have a lot to talk about this evening. I'm very excited to talk about a lot of different fascinating topics with you this evening. I will just share with you, before I forget, actually, I may as well mention it now, the National Jewish Retreat. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of attending. I have the opportunity to both attend and speak at many different events across the calendar. I will tell you in all honesty that the National Jewish Retreat is by far and away my absolute favorite event. Both as a participant and as a speaker, it is just one of the most extraordinary events in the entire Jewish world. So I encourage you all, if you haven't had the opportunity to come, to make every effort to come. Even if you can come for a day, come for a day, because next time you'll come for the entire time. You're more than welcome if you do come to join any of the medical sessions. They are not exclusively for medical people. They are open absolutely for everybody. We cover a lot of fascinating topics, but that's just a tiny sliver of the event, which covers a whole array of every aspect of Judaism, and including film and culinary arts and everything you can imagine. So enough of my plug for that, which I again strongly recommend, and I genuinely hope we can see each other in person this coming JLI retreat, God willing. But since the last time the Rabbi and I saw each other, which was at the last retreat that was in person, obviously much has happened in the world, and we're going to talk a fair amount about one major aspect of that in the course of our session today. I just want to give you an overview both of where I stand, what I'm doing, and what we're going to be talking about this evening. I am an emergency medicine physician at one of the busiest hospitals in the country, Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx. We see hundreds of thousands of cases a year just in our emergency department. And of course, in the past 8-9 months, I personally have been seeing many cases of coronavirus, of COVID-19 pandemic that we find ourselves in the midst of presently. It has been a very personally challenging time for me, and I have an opportunity to share with you some halachic aspects of one very important dimension of this pandemic in just a few moments. But just to lay out what we're going to be talking about today, and by the way, you can ask me personal questions too. questions that relate to our session, not relate to our session. Everything is fair game. The whole gamut of Jewish medical ethics and medicine is fair game. But in terms of the layout for the session for this evening, I'm going to share with you just a little bit about the context of the pandemic, give us a little historical perspective. Then we're going to talk about vaccines largely, and the rabbinic literature that relates to vaccines. And then we're going to use as a springboard one dimension of the vaccines, especially the vaccines that are presently available in the United States, is a genetic aspect, which is the fact that they are derivative from mRNA, from part of the human that enters the human cell. It's part of our genetic system. And use that as a launching pad to discuss genetics in general within the Jewish community and how genetics finds its expression in rabbinic literature. So I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint, and again, I encourage you to ask questions, and the rabbi can relay them to me. This is an article from just a few weeks ago. The New York Times, 20 phrases that defined 2020. And one of those phrases is unprecedented. And this is a word which I think you've probably had your fill of these past many months. And my objective really for this session is to share with you that while it's true this pandemic in many ways is unprecedented, the Jewish experience throughout history will reveal that many aspects of this pandemic are actually precedented. And we have seen very similar things. We'll talk specifically about vaccination, but we'll, as a preface, we'll talk about a few other areas where we have seen similar aspects to this pandemic. But just to share with you where we are presently, this is a map from today, from January 19th. 95, almost 96 million global cases. Very tragically, we crossed the threshold over 400,000 deaths in the United States, around the same amount of people we lost in World War II. The aspect which is very unprecedented is this number down at the bottom. This number down at the bottom is 191. What does that number represent? That number represents the number of countries that have people with coronavirus. How many countries are there in the entire world? Well, according to the United Nations, there's 195 countries. So, so 191 out of 195 countries have people afflicted with the disease COVID-19. So this is truly unprecedented in its scope and magnitude to cover so many different countries. And what we are experiencing now, just to share with you that before we get to vaccination, that there are other areas where the Jewish community has experienced similar things. So one aspect which you are all familiar with is the closing of synagogues. And I actually didn't get a chance to ask the rabbi where you guys stand now in Atlanta in terms of inside, outside. We are now allowed inside, but still socially distanced and masked, of course. Despite that, many of us are still davening outside. We are in New York, so it is wintertime for us. So it is quite cold davening outside, but nonetheless, we are still, many people are still davening outside. So the closing of synagogues. So you might think, this is unprecedented. Never before have synagogues been closed in the Jewish community. And the truth is, there is one dimension which is unprecedented. It's never been the case that synagogues across the entire globe were closed at the same time. That is genuinely unprecedented, but as we'll see in a moment, the concept is not unprecedented. And to such an extent where people are giving lectures. This is a Hasidic rabbi delivering a lecture a number of months ago from the balcony because the synagogues are closed. He has no other option. He can't be in the same room with people. So he actually gave his lecture from his balcony, from his mirpeset, as they say in Israel. Is this something which has precedent in the Jewish world and the Jewish community? And the answer is, fascinatingly, this does. And the precedent comes from this work called Otzar HaChaim in the upper right-hand side. This work was written by a prominent rabbi and physician in Rome in the late 1600s, whose name was Yaakov Tzahalon. And Rabbi Dr. Yaakov Tzalon lived during the time of a bubonic plague pandemic in Rome in the 1600s. And he writes about that pandemic in this work, which is actually a medical work. When he talks about fevers called pestilential fevers, fevers related to plague, he remembers what it was like during the pandemic. And he writes, since the people were unable to come to the synagogue on Shabbat Parshat Toldot, which was November 18th, 1656, I, Yaakov Tzalon, delivered a sermon at the corner of Catalani Street from the window of the home of David Gottini, and the congregation stood in the street below to listen. On another occasion, I delivered a sermon on Tuscany Street from the window of the home of Yehuda Gottini. And he writes for us, additionally, things that we can relate to, literally 400 years later, 300 to 400 years later. He says that a lazaretto was established for the infected patients. A lazaretto is a home of isolation or quarantine. People could not leave their homes. People could only leave at designated times to obtain food. At night, no one was allowed out. They had a curfew. And if you left outside at night, you would be placed in a prison within the ghetto. And if you congregated, people could not congregate. If you congregated in the streets, a gallows, you read correctly, a gallows was built near the gate of the ghetto to punish those who violated this rule. And this is actually an illustration of that gallows. This is the entrance to the ghetto in Rome. If you look very closely, you'll see the post of the gallows and the cross beam of the gallows. And if people violated that, that would be their punishment. Synagogue and social distancing. Also, before we get to vaccination, just a fascinating point. This is also something to which there is clearly precedent in our history. And I draw your attention to this remarkable work. And for those of you who are interested more about this, hasn't yet been translated into English, but I can share with you more literature. In the 1600s, 1631, in northern Italy, there was a plague, a bubonic plague, which decimated the Jewish community of Padua. And one of the people who took care of the people then, his name was Abraham Catalano. He was a physician. He tended not only to the medical aspects, but both to the religious aspects as well as the financial aspects of the plague. He wrote a diary, a daily diary of all his experiences. And it's such an extraordinarily fascinating and tragic read, but it's so instructive for us today. The similarities are quite remarkable. But he writes there about social distancing in synagogue, and he said they had a number of synagogues in Padua, but they prayed in only one synagogue during the plague. But he said the unmarried men would occupy the courtyard of the Ashkenazi synagogue, so they asked the unmarried men to go outside, and those that usually pray in the Italian synagogue would go up to the women's section. Why? In order to maintain distance between the people during prayer service. So they had social distancing. This is social distancing in the 1600s. And they had more formal social distancing by Rabbi Akiva Eger. Rabbi Akiva Eger is a famous rabbi in Poland in the 1800s. And he said this in the session in a letter that I don't have right before you, but I'll comment on this in a moment. He said that during the weekdays, only 15 people should be in synagogue at any given time, and they should have more services and rotate services, and you have to sign up for a service. It's remarkable. This could have been written today. And he said for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they actually did a lottery to determine which half of the congregation could attend for Rosh Hashanah, and the other half would attend for Yom Kippur. And he said it could, and because of the fear for contagion, he said they limited the davening to 5 hours on Rosh Hashanah, which means that the normal davening was much longer than 5 hours. Here, just to give you an idea of how things have changed, they limited the davening to 2 hours on Rosh Hashanah. And also no additional aliyot. The chazan shouldn't take a long time. People would probably like this even if it wasn't a pandemic. But but let's now turn to vaccines and see some interesting parallels between the present and the past here as well. So here is where we stand now. Thank God, vaccines have been developed at a breakneck pace, historically far faster than any time ever in the history of the world. We now have a number of vaccines. 2 of them have been released. Just personally, I am one of the so-called frontline workers because I'm in the emergency room treating COVID patients on a daily basis. So I've already received not only my first dose of vaccine, I've already received my second dose of vaccine. People are always interested, how did it go for you? Did you have any side effects? Did you not have any side effects? Of course, you all want to know that, I'm sure. So after the first vaccine, I had very minimal, just a little arm pain. After the second vaccine, I had, and by the way, I took the Pfizer vaccine. After the second vaccine, I had a little bit of body aches, which lasted a few hours, but that was pretty much it. So here you have before you the four main vaccines, and I highlight here that the two that are out now in the United States, primarily Pfizer and Moderna, are RNA vaccines, and they work in a genetic fashion. And we're going to get back to genetics a little bit later in our discussion. But obviously, the major questions that the entire world has been addressing is the safety of these vaccines, safety in general, and the safety because the rapidity with which they were developed. And many rabbis, literally every major rabbi across the globe, has been addressing these issues. Should they vaccinate? Should they not vaccinate? Et cetera, et cetera. What I'd like to share with you for the next few moments is to go back in time to the history of vaccination and show how the rabbis at that time addressed some of the Jewish legal issues which faced them, and they were really quite unique at that time. So just a question here, and I unfortunately can't hear you because you're muted, but maybe you can put it in the chat. What is this a picture of? This is a picture of a rash on a person's hand. Oh, there's a rash on a person's hand. So does anyone have any clue what kind of rash they're looking at? So the answer to the question, I'm just going to see if I can even see the chat over here. Ah, good. So we got a couple people that know the answer to this. The answer is smallpox. Now, if I were to ask you how many of you have ever seen an actual case of smallpox, some of you may have. Some of you may have never seen a case of smallpox. I suspect that most of you have never seen a case of smallpox, but you could have seen. But had you seen a case of smallpox, the last case that the world had seen is in the early 70s. That's the last case of smallpox that the world has seen, of spontaneous smallpox. And just to give you an idea of the impact of that disease, it probably existed. It may have existed since antiquity. Some say that Ramses V, one of the Egyptian kings, has some bumps on his face. Some say that it's smallpox. They couldn't isolate DNA from him, even though they're pretty good at isolating DNA. But a 3,000-year-old mummy, they couldn't isolate the DNA from the skin lesions. It really came to its full force in the 18th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So most statisticians believe that around 300 million people died of smallpox, which is roughly the population of the United States. How many people die of smallpox today? Answer: 0. Not one single person dies of smallpox. Why not? Answer is vaccination. And we're going to talk about the original smallpox vaccination and what the rabbis of that time talked about. So you can imagine living in a world of smallpox where so many people are dying. And by the way, the rough estimates are between 25 and 30% mortality for smallpox. That means like one out of 4 or one out of 3 patients who contracted smallpox died of smallpox throughout the time that the disease afflicted the world. So you can imagine when there was a potential treatment for smallpox, there was a tremendous amount of excitement. So here you have this treatment. It's called variolation or inoculation. And what do they do in this treatment? They would take a child who had smallpox, they take a little scalpel or lancet and remove the fluid, and then they'd inject that fluid under the skin of a healthy child. Now, what was the logic? They didn't understand virology. They didn't understand immunology. So what were they thinking at the time? So they were thinking the following. They were thinking that you would contract the disease, but you'd probably, since you're only getting a small amount of it and you're giving it to somebody who's healthy, they would probably get a mild form, and nothing bad would happen to them. And the truth is, they were right in the overwhelming majority of the time, but they weren't right all the time. And in fact, what you have here is, these are some reactions that you can get to the smallpox inoculation. But this is a reflection of what can potentially happen. And this is a tombstone, which actually is not far from where I am. I live in the New York area. This is a tombstone in Huntington, Long Island. I live in the southern tip of Long Island. And the tombstone reads, "In memory of Peleg, son of Thomas and Mary Conklin, who died of smallpox by inoculation." So this is a kid who was 17, age 17 years old, healthy child, got inoculated, and as a result of the inoculation, he died. He contracted the full form of smallpox. Now the question is, and this is the halachic question, what the person who gave him that smallpox inoculation, is he considered a physician and a healer, or is he considered a murderer? The person was healthy before, and he only died because the doctor gave him a disease, albeit for the purpose of protecting from a more severe form of the disease. So that was a very serious dilemma. It's a dilemma that this rabbi addressed and asked other rabbis to address in a small volume in 1785 in England. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Nansich, and he wrote a book called Alei Trufa, and he wrote it because he lost 2 of his own children to smallpox. And he heard about this variolation, inoculation, and he wrote this book begging the rabbis of the community to address this from a medical and from a halachic perspective. Now, what was the issue from a halachic perspective? A halachic perspective is that the rabbi mentioned that his bar mitzvah parsha is Parshas Mishpatim, and Mishpatim has the famous 2 words, v'rapo yirapeh, you shall surely heal, which is the license to heal. So the Torah gives us as physicians a license to heal. It gives you a license to heal somebody who's sick. Does it give you a license to inject somebody who's healthy with a disease? Maybe not so clear. So this was the first time in the history of medicine where a doctor is injecting a disease into a human being. So is that halachically permitted? Is that not halachically permitted? And here we have an indication even in the American history records. Benjamin Franklin wrote in his Pennsylvania Gazette, he reported on 72 Bostonians who were inoculated in March 1730. Only 2 had died, while the rest recovered in perfect health. Of those who had it in the common way, he continued, it is computed that 1 in 4 died. So 25 to 30% of those who contracted it spontaneously or naturally died. But if you got it through inoculation, far, far fewer, 2 out of 72. And he actually says on a personal note, in 1736, I lost one of my own sons, age 4 years old, and he regrets that he didn't inoculate his own son. So rabbis discuss this issue. And here you have one case, Rabbi Yishmael HaKohen of Modena in Italy. Imuter lasos pulas havracha ha'ababuot. Ababuot refers to smallpox. Dahainu inoculazioni shel havarioli. It's Italian, so inoculazioni of variola, which is smallpox. And he writes here that. And he thinks about it. He says, listen, I'll synopsize what he says here on the left side. If this person may never contract the disease, he may contract the disease and survive. You're giving him a little small amount of that disease, which he could die from. So maybe it's not so clear that you can give this variolation or inoculation. There's a significant risk. But at the end of the day, especially because many others strongly recommended, is that on balance, since the likelihood of surviving is much, much higher when you inoculated, he supported inoculation, as did many other rabbis. And this is one of the more famous passages in rabbinic literature supporting this. And this is Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz, who wrote, "Umizeh nirli heter la'asos inoculation shel pakin." I permit this inoculation. Why? Inoculation, even though 1 in 1,000 may die as a result of it, if they contract it spontaneously, in the midst of an epidemic, the likelihood of dying is much, much higher. So he actually advocated for this inoculation. I will tell you that, let me just move here for a second. So what happened? What do I do with my Edward Jenner? I apologize. So Edward Jenner, when did things change? Things changed with Edward Jenner. Edward Jenner did a different kind of study than variolation, which is the ones that we just talked about. What he did is, which many of you are probably familiar with, is he actually realized, and he wasn't the first one to realize this, that people who contracted cowpox, which is a totally different disease from animals, from milking cows, would not succumb to smallpox. And he tested this. It probably wouldn't have been approved by a ethics committee today. And he found out that, lo and behold, he gave people cowpox and then injected them with smallpox after that, and found out that the people survived and did not die as a result. And that was, and why is it called vaccination? The very term owes itself to the history of the experiment, because vacca in Latin is cow. So the term vaccination relates to that. And just to share with you, vaccination has had its downsides. So vaccination, for example, there have been problems with vaccination as well. So there were, for example, in April, in the polio vaccination, they had a bad batch of polio vaccination in April 1955. It's a famous episode called the Cutter incident. Now, the polio vaccine was supposed to be a live attenuated virus or inactivated virus. One batch got out without being inactivated, and it actually ended up causing people to contract the disease polio. And Rabbi, you'll appreciate this. These are letters from Lubavitch Rebbe. This is a letter addressing exactly this issue about faith and trust in vaccines. And he actually writes, "B'masha kasav odos hazrikos chison masha kara lo aleinu b'artzot harit melufnim kiganda." Talks about, which maybe people don't realize, but he's referring to this Cutter episode. He said, yes, that was a tragic episode, but they have fixed the problem. They are no longer having this kind of issue. They're extraordinarily careful, and he strongly supported and recommended vaccines. Today, again, talking about today versus yesteryear, today we talk about vaccinations. Is it permitted to take the vaccination on Shabbos? Right now here in the United States, the vaccines have rolled out. Unfortunately, it seems like there seems to be a shortage of vaccines. I'm not sure. The government said they had a whole store of vaccines. It's not really so clear what the next few weeks or months hold. But let's say you're offered to take, let's say your only appointment is on a Shabbos and they have no other appointments, and you're a high-risk person. Are you allowed to violate Shabbos in order to get a vaccine? So these are responses by Rabbi Usher Weiss, who's one of the famous contemporary rabbinic authorities. And to make a long story short, he said you couldn't violate biblical prohibitions because technically you're not sick right now. But rabbinic prohibitions, you probably could. You could walk to the clinic, and you may be able to do other things which might violate rabbinic prohibitions in order to take the vaccine. Is that something which they talked about in the past? And the answer is yes. Even in the times of variolation, which we talked about before, how did it work in those days? It worked in the following way. The barber surgeons used to go from town to town and inject people with these little aliquots of smallpox, but they'd just spend a few hours in your town. So let's say they were in your town for a few hours and the only time they were there was Shabbos. Are you allowed to get inoculated or variolated on the Shabbos? So here, Rabbi Eliezer Fleckel's, known as the Tshuva Me'ava, he said that indeed you could. He said because the risk of not receiving this inoculation and contracting the disease in the midst of the pandemic was so high that he would allow you to receive it. Again, he said he would minimize the violations as much as possible. but he would allow you to receive the vaccine. Another issue which is being discussed in contemporary rabbinic world is triage of vaccines. Who gets the vaccine first? And here you have a one discussion by Rabbi Yosef Rimon, who's one of the prominent rabbinic authorities in Israel today. And he writes, who should get the vaccine first? And it's a very sophisticated analysis. He says, Mi shenimtza b'matzav mesukan yoter, someone who is sick. So for example, the geriatric population, either over 75, and now here they've rolled it out over 65, or people that have immunocompromised, a whole variety of illnesses, which puts them at a high risk of the disease, or mi shenimtza b'matzav shebo hu ma'avir yoter et hamachala. So do you alternatively give the vaccine to someone who is a greater spreader, a super spreader of the disease? So this was and remains a debate in the medical community. Is it preferable to give, for example, like the people who suffer the most were clearly who very debilitated in nursing homes, with tragically a very high mortality? So do you vaccinate the entire nursing home population first? Or where are the people in the nursing homes getting it from? They're getting it from the younger, healthier population. If you vaccinate the young, healthy population, even though they themselves wouldn't generally get a fatal form of the disease, but by vaccinating them, you'll be protecting others. So it's a very interesting debate. And another debate, which to my knowledge has not yet been expressed in the rabbinic literature in terms of triaging vaccines, is a debate which is taking place, for example, between the United Kingdom and other countries in the world. In the United Kingdom, they've decided to use all their vaccines to vaccinate as many people as possible for a first dose of vaccine, and then worry about the second dose of vaccine later.
I went to my hospital today to get vaccines.
I'm sorry?
What
do you mean?
The United States has been contemplating this, and it's a question: do you vaccinate a larger number of people in a less effective fashion, or a smaller number of people in a more effective fashion? And I think you will be reading, and have been reading in the very recent past, about the significant differential between the effectiveness of the first vaccine and the second vaccine. Originally, Pfizer said that the first vaccine confers like around 50% immunity. There's studies in Israel which show that it actually may be less than that for the first dose, but there are very comforting and confirming studies that if you do receive the second dose, the immunity is very high for those who receive the second dose. So it's not so clear whether vaccinating more people with the first dose will be effective. And I'm sure you're all hearing and reading about people who have contracted the disease not only after the first dose of the vaccine, but you likely read about Rabbi Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel, who contracted the virus after the second dose of vaccine. And you may ask, how is that possible? So he likely contracted it after the first, and probably even before he received the second dose of vaccine, or very early before, shortly after he received that second dose, because as we said, the first dose really doesn't give you significant immunity. So that's not a problem. And by the way, even if you do get it, you're likely to get a much less severe form, which thank God, at least to my knowledge, as we speak this evening, he has gotten a very mild form. There really is no precedent for in historical halachic literature of triaging for vaccines, because the vaccines, there was really there was really only one opportunity, the vaccine of Jenner. There weren't multiple vaccines. They didn't have the distribution system. So basically it was a process that took many years to vaccinate people. And they didn't have these kinds of triage discussions at that time. They weren't as sensitive to the ethical dilemmas either. Vaccine challenge studies is something also which has been discussed. What is a vaccine challenge study? Vaccine challenge study, you have the entire world in the midst of a pandemic, and you all know that we now, from beginning to end, it took just months for these vaccines to be rolled out for distribution to the world, albeit in an emergency type of fashion. The question is, you want to get these vaccines out as fast as possible. If you do a normal vaccine study, which these largely were, you have to wait a fair number of time, a number of months at least, after people receive both the placebo and the actual drug to see if people spontaneously contract the virus that you're vaccinating for. Now that can take time. Some people may never get it, they may not get exposed, and you're going to have to wait a fair amount of time. With a challenge study, which has been recommended, and there have been a number of places across the world where they have done challenge studies, you actually take both populations, both the placebo and the arm of the study that, no pun intended, that received the vaccine, and shortly after receiving the vaccine, you subject them actively to the virus. You inject them with the COVID-19 virus and see if they contract the disease and if they don't. What's the problem? The problem is, assuming the vaccine is very effective, you're taking 50% of your study who are placebo and injecting them with the virus for which they have no protection. So you are intentionally infecting them with a virus which could cause them significant harm, even potentially cause them death. Is that something which the medical community tolerates? Is that something which the halachic community tolerates? So in this particular study, this was from the Lancet, COVID-19 Human Challenge Studies in the United Kingdom. He said there's, in this worldwide pandemic emergency, time lost means lives lost. Thus, there is a moral imperative to develop a safe and effective vaccine as soon as possible. Chance of someone aged 20, 30, which is mostly the population of the studies, dying from COVID is about the same as the annual risk of dying in a car accident. That is a reasonable risk to take, especially to save hundreds of thousands of lives. It is surprising challenge studies were not done sooner. Given the stakes, it is unethical not to do challenge studies. That was the position of the Lancet. This here is a halachic discussion from August, signing up for COVID-19 vaccine trials. This has not been, by the way, and this is where I have the Jenner slide again. Jenner's trial was a challenge study. That's exactly what it was. He gave the people cowpox, then he challenged them with smallpox afterwards. So his study was really the first challenge study. What does Jewish law have to say about challenge studies? So Jewish law says that it is permitted. It is absolutely permitted for people to take a limited risk, especially young, healthy people, in order to save the lives of others. They are permitted to take a calculated risk. And of course, every case has to be analyzed and the risk has to be minimized to the extent possible. So doing a study where the fatality is really potentially very high and people really have no clue, that's another matter. But in this study where vaccine was deemed to be largely effective and the risk to the young, healthy people is serious, but limited, many rabbis believe that it would be permissible to do it. Another aspect which arose in this vaccine, and I'll just mention this very briefly, is blessings. Do you say a blessing when you receive the vaccine? Fascinating question. This question did not come up in the pre-modern or pre-Moderna era, as I like to say. So vaccination is surely a blessing, but which one? We're not going to occupy ourselves with the halachic analysis, but suffice it to say there are multiple different approaches as to which blessing you should say, if any blessing. Rabbi Usher Weiss said that there's a Talmudic prayer that one should say. Rabbi Herschel Schachter said there's a special blessing called Hatov HaMeitiv, which is thanking God for the good. Rabbi Dr. Daniel Sperber said you should say Shehechianu, thanking God that we have reached this day, that the vaccine has been developed. And Rabbi Shmuel Eliyahu says a beautiful blessing. I actually said personally, I said the Talmudic blessing in addition to this blessing by Shmuel Eliyahu, which is a beautiful blessing, thanking God for allowing the scientists to develop this vaccine and to hopefully eliminate the Magefa, the pandemic. After Jenner developed the vaccine, there weren't prayers per se, but there was tremendous appreciation and thanks. And the same author, as we mentioned before, Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, Tiferes Yisrael, considers Jenner one of the greatest Gentiles, one of the greatest non-Jews in the history of the world from his time. He calls him HaChasid Jenner, Shehimtzi HaPaken Impfung. So he lists some great people in the history of the world, and one of them is Edward Jenner, who developed smallpox vaccination. He also adds to that Draka, which is Sir Francis Drake, who brought potatoes to Europe, which is debated historically, and Gutenberg, who founded or developed the press. Anti-Semitism and vaccination. Rabbi, just in terms of my planning, what time do you want us to end?
I think we're so far so good with time.
Good.
Some questions have come in, but I think
Okay, good.
I think I'll present them soon. Not
great.
right this second.
Great. So I figured. So can we go right now? It's about 10 to 9. I figured like 9:10. Is that too late?
I think that's fine. Yeah, and I think
great.
we also want to get into some of the the kind of like the advances in medical science outside of
So let me know what maybe I will I'll move ahead and we'll I'll just do one more aspect from this, which I think you'll find fascinating, and then I'll move to the advances in science, and we'll spend the rest of our time on the advances in science. Jews claiming religious exemption to vaccination is something that we are seeing in our day and age. And the question arises, so for example, the Orthodox community in Rockland County, where the city of Muncie is, statistics show that Rockland County's immunization rates are below the 96% goal. More than 20 Orthodox schools report that 10% of the kids claim a religious exemption from vaccination. So the question is it permitted to claim religious exemption? And is there a precedent in history to claim religious exemption? So the answer is there is a fascinating precedent. This is from 1896. There's a Jew who claimed religious exemption from smallpox vaccination in England, where it was legally required. He refused. He said, "I'm Jewish, I can't take it because it comes from a cow." And the rabbi said, "It's not kosher." He really said it's not kosher. He said the vaccine is not kosher because it comes from a cow. I couldn't eat the cow. Cow's treif. It's a sick cow. I shouldn't have it injected into my skin either. So they put him in jail, and the prosecutor was Jewish. He felt guilty about it. So he went to the chief rabbi at that time, was Rabbi Adler. Rabbi Adler said this man was not justified in making the statements contained in the letter. So the most competent medical authorities were agreed as to vaccination being a prophylactic against smallpox. And it's perfect consonance with the letter and spirit of Judaism. Bottom line is, you really cannot claim religious exemption. The Torah does not prohibit you from vaccinating by any stretch. You may not have to vaccinate, but definitely doesn't prohibit you from vaccinating. And many rabbis actually would even obligate you vaccinating. So let's talk about something connected to the vaccines. The vaccines are mRNA vaccines. What is RNA? What does it have to do with your genetics? Does it affect your genome? Does it cause you? Does it wreak havoc in your DNA? Does it cause fertility problems? Those were concerns about the vaccine. And the short answer to that is they do not. None of these issues are real. There's no concern for affecting fertility with these vaccines. They do not enter. They enter the fluid, the cytoplasm of the cell. They don't enter the nucleus of the cell. They don't affect your DNA in any way, shape, or form. And as a matter of fact, the mRNA molecules are so volatile that they degrade very rapidly. They had to create a special package of lipids around them in order to get them into the cell so that they don't decompose. But I want to use this as an opportunity to talk about aspects of genetics which we in the Jewish community do deal with and do talk about in very specific and detailed ways. And just to share with you this fascinating illustration about the relationship between Torah and genetics, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So this picture is worth 304,000 words, which is the number of words in the Torah scroll. And it's a reflection of the fact that that not only is Torah a part of our DNA collectively, but I think the converse is also true. DNA and science and understanding the composition of the human body is also part of our Torah, is part of our tradition, understanding science in a very sophisticated fashion. And here you have an angel telling God, the human genome code has been unraveled. So God says, those darn hackers, now I have to change the password. So genetics, the Jewish community has a very strong connection to genetics. And in fact, the very first disease which was testable and understood to have a genetic cause was tay-sachs disease, which is disease which affects largely the Ashkenazi Jewish community. And it's named after two Jewish physicians. This is Dr. Tay, whose article here in Warren Tay is an ophthalmologist who noticed unique findings in patients with tay-sachs disease. This is the original article by Tay in Transactions of the Ophthalmological Society of the UK. This is the so-called cherry red spot. And this is Dr. Sachs, Bernard Sachs, who was a neurologist who noticed neurological developmental issues in tay-sachs. That's why it's called the hyphenated tay-sachs disease. And it was back in the 1960s that we started to test for this. And the question was, if you could test for it, should you test for it? Should you test for it before one gets married? And this is a question which was asked the greatest rabbinic authority of that time, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, whose response in Hebrew you see on the bottom of the slide. And he said, you most certainly should. If it's something which is easily testable, it could prevent tragedy, because if a man and woman both are carriers for the gene, they themselves have no problem. But there's a 1 in 4 chance they will have progeny afflicted with basically a fatal disease. So he strongly recommended it. You know, fast forward to 2021, it used to be that there was only one disease that was tested for, and there was an organization called Dor Yesharim, which you may have heard of, which still exists to this day. But now there are many other organizations which test for genetics, including JScreen, and this is a list of the diseases they test for. Over 200 diseases are tested for these genetic testing. And then the questions arose, once you're able to test, you can also test the fetus. And the questions that were discussed back in the 1970s and 80s, if you can test the fetus and you find out the fetus is afflicted with the disease, are you permitted to perform an abortion or not? Once you know that the fetus has tay-sachs. And the rabbis there discussed, and there were polar opposite opinions, some holding it was prohibited to perform an abortion, some holding it was permitted to perform an abortion even up to the 6th or 7th month of gestation. But how have things changed in the 21st century? So nowadays, instead of testing the fetus in utero, now you can harvest the egg and harvest the sperm, fertilize them in the laboratory to produce embryos, and then you can test the embryo by a procedure called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And you can determine, and here's, this is one of the earlier methods of this, but this is a pipette literally extracting a cell from the 8-cell embryo, the blastocyst. And you can take that one cell and send it to the laboratory and perform any aspect of genetic testing available at that time. And you can tell the gender of the child, you can tell if the child is afflicted with tay-sachs, and then you can decide not to implant those particular embryos. So that's how far we have come. Another very important aspect of genetics in the Jewish community is genetics in the determination of maternity. So it's fascinating that 3 out of 4, 75% of the matriarchs suffered from infertility. And today we have many treatments for infertility, and one of those treatments is surrogacy, surrogate motherhood. So you can have one woman who contributes the egg and another woman who carries the child. So one woman contributes the genetics, the genes. So the question is, who is the halachic mother in that case? Is it the genetic mother? Is it the so-called gestational mother? And the big question is, to whom do you send a card on Mother's Day? Now, of course, Hallmark holds that both mothers are considered the halachic mother. And things have become so complicated that you might see an ad like this in the Jewish newspapers. I was reform as an embryo, conservative as a fetus, and orthodox from birth, seeking same. So suffice it to say that there is no absolute consensus on this issue of who is considered the halachic mother. Is it the genetic mother? Is it the halachic mother? I mean, is it the gestational mother, the mother who carries the child? Since we are talking specifically about genetics, I'm going to share with you some challenges to the position who holds that it's the genetics that determines maternity. So there's some who hold that the egg is the determinant. Whoever provides the egg, if the egg donor is Jewish, the child is Jewish. If the egg donor is not Jewish, then the child would not be Jewish. That means the child would need a conversion, by the way. So these are important halachic ramifications if the surrogate mother was not Jewish. And that's really the issue when one partner of the process is Jewish and the other is not. But this technology, which is really extraordinary technology, challenges the genetic determination. And here's the concept of this technology. Now, we said that the RNA that's injected, that ends up into the cells for the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, is comprised of RNA and doesn't get into the nucleus. The nucleus has the bulk of chromosomes. The nucleus has the 46 chromosomes, all the chromosomes we talk about in terms of Mendelian genetics. But there are also chromosomes in a very small organelle that floats in the cytoplasm. And that organelle is called the mitochondria. Within the mitochondria are actual DNA, a very tiny percentage of your entire genome, but DNA, and important DNA nonetheless. Sometimes that DNA can be defective. And if it's defective, it can wreak havoc on your progeny. And what's also important to appreciate here, and fascinating and has relevance in halachic discussions, is that this DNA in the mitochondria is only transmitted from mother to child. And we'll see the relevance to that in just a moment. So let's say, and this is not science fiction we're about to talk about now, let's say, for example, a woman has found out through genetic testing that she has a disease in her mitochondrial DNA, and she's worried she's going to have a child with a severe disease. Is there anything one can do today? So the answer is yes, there is. You can perform what's called mitochondrial replacement. What does that mean? And very simply, it's the following. You have a woman who has defective DNA in her mitochondria. You take her egg, you remove the nucleus from her egg, you take another egg of a woman with healthy mitochondrial DNA, remove her nucleus, and replace it with the nucleus of woman A. So now you have an egg which is a composite of the healthy nuclear DNA of woman A and the healthy mitochondrial DNA of woman B. Then you can take that egg and fertilize it with the sperm of the husband of woman A. So now you have what is called a three-parent embryo or three-parent baby. This is the question, who is the halachic mother of this child? If you hold genetics as the determinant, is it the nuclear DNA mother or is it the mitochondrial DNA mother? And you can imagine a situation where a child, this is the 21st century, child saying to his mother, "You can't talk to me like that. You're only my mitochondrial mother." So the rabbis have been discussing this. This is not science fiction. Rabbis are discussing, do we go like kashrus? You know, if a piece of milk falls into a vat of meat, it becomes nullified. We call it bittul. So do we say that the mitochondrial DNA, which is only a tiny amount, becomes bittul, becomes nullified to the rest of the DNA, and we really don't consider it? Or because mitochondrial DNA is so important for function, do we say they have a viable right to be called mother as well? So these are questions. These are questions that are being discussed, and I'd like to share with you actually on the same topic of mitochondrial DNA another really fascinating application of mitochondrial DNA, but from a totally different perspective. And this one, I'm going to go off slide here for a moment, and just to share with you this application of mitochondrial DNA. Now, as we mentioned, mitochondrial DNA is passed from the mother to the child. Why is that relevant, and how is that relevant for the following situation? Let me share with you the following fictional scenario, which probably won't be fictional in the not too distant future. You have a child, a boy that's in college, on an American college campus, comes home and brings his girlfriend with him. And he says, "Mom and Dad, I have good news and bad news. Good news is I found an amazing girl. She's definitely the one. The bad news is, unfortunately, she's Catholic. But the good news is she took a test. She sent her saliva to Ancestry DNA, and Ancestry DNA says that her mitochondrial DNA matches exactly to the mitochondrial DNA of a nice Orthodox Jewish woman from 100 years ago." So the question is, from a biological perspective, since mitochondrial DNA is maternally transmitted, that means she is a maternal descendant of a known Orthodox Jewish woman, which means, and since Judaism is matrilineally determined, it means she should be a halachic Jew. Should she, therefore, or can she, swap out her cross for a Magen David and go to shul the next day and finished, and she's Jewish? The answer is maybe. Maybe the answer may be yes. We have not had any case like that yet. But how is this mitochondrial DNA being used today? It's being used for the following reason, and this is just extraordinary use of science technology to help solve and help people from a halachic fashion. There are thousands and thousands of Jews or people that came from the former Soviet Union, many of whom are unsure if they are Jewish or not. And their status is a significant question. When does it come to the fore? It comes to the fore in Israel when they want to get married, because in order to get married in Israel, they have to show documentation that they're Jewish. Unfortunately, many of these people, they don't have gravestones that they can turn to. They have no records that they can turn to. So many times they're asked to convert out of suffolk, out of doubt. Maybe they're Jewish, maybe they're not. The question is, scientists are now canvassing the mitochondrial DNA of large populations of the Jewish community, and they're finding that within the Ashkenazi Jewish community, there are shared mutations in the mitochondrial DNA, which most Ashkenazi Jews have. Now, this is evolving research, obviously, and continuing. Thousands of people are continually being tested, and this data is continuing to be reanalyzed. But the question is, if these people do this genetic test and they find out that they share these common mutations with the Ashkenazi Jewish community, would that alone be sufficient to identify them as Jews and obviate the need for conversion? Or maybe perhaps if there's other corroborative evidence which is less halachically valid, but together with the genetic test, that together with the genetic test would render them halachic Jews. So these are questions which the chief rabbinate of Israel pre-COVID was one of the issues which the rabbis at that time were dealing with. But just to return, actually, that is a fascinating application of genetics and mitochondrial DNA. I just want to share with you, and I think this will be the last thing to share with you before we open up for questions. I'm happy to entertain the questions. We talked about maternity. Another aspect of maternity and genetics and maternity, this technology is also extraordinarily fascinating. We said there's a debate about who's the halachic mother. So now, here's the following technology, which literally blows the lid off the roof of debates of maternity and paternity in crazy ways. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but according to basic biology, and this is not necessarily something sanctioned within the Jewish community per se, but if you have two people of the same gender that want to have a child together, it is generally biologically impossible for, say, two women to have a child together that is biologically related to both of them. Correct? So yes, that was correct until now. How is it different now? It's different for the following technology. Now, no child, human child that we know of has been born with this technology, but this technology has been used in animals, and the likelihood of it, there's proof of concept. The likelihood of it being used in humans is relatively high in the near future. You have two women, and what you can do is you can take the stem cells from the bone marrow of one of the women, and you can cultivate from those stem cells. Now, stem cells are early embryological cells that are found in different parts of the body, and they are found in the bone marrow. You can cultivate one of those stem cells to produce a gamete. Gamete are the cells of sexual generation. Now, here is the important fact. It can produce either a sperm or an egg. So this woman can produce a sperm from her stem cell. You can then take her partner's egg cell, fertilize it with the sperm cell, and then either one could potentially carry the child to term. Now, just suffice it to say, there are even other potential permutations and variations. Maybe even both of them could possibly carry it part of the gestation, but we'll leave that aside for now. Even a man could potentially carry it with a uterus transplant. We'll leave aside that for now as well. But so the question is, this now child is produced from the sperm of a woman and the egg of a woman, and now is born. My question to you is, who is the halachic father of that child? So never before in the history of mankind has a woman been able to produce sperm. Is it halachically possible for a woman to be a father of a child? Or does this child have no father at all? Or perhaps the child's father is the father of the woman who donated the sperm? So these are the kinds of questions that we are dealing with in the world of genetics. We didn't even get a chance to cover all of them. These are just some to raise some issues. So just to conclude, and I'm happy to open up for any questions, both on these technologies or any others you may know of or want to learn about. We've had an opportunity to discuss from the beginning. I'm actually just going to return to the slides just for a second, just to share the last. Slides. We talked about the pandemic that we find ourselves in. And we talked about some of the history that we have precedented times that we've seen things happen in the world similar to what we're experiencing today. And we talked a lot about vaccinations and the halacha of vaccinations, ending off as we did with a fascinating discussion about contemporary genetics in the halachic world. But I just want to return to that theme of precedent. So there is a precedent for the eradication of disease. The smallpox that we talked about was literally eradicated from the face of the earth. And this is the global smallpox eradication. There hasn't been a single case since 1974 or 75. So we have a precedent for that. I am hoping, and this is my last slide, that precedent will become a reality here, that instead of global smallpox eradication, we'll have global COVID-19 eradication in the modern or Moderna era in every country across the globe, every continent across the globe, in 2021. So I hope, Mitzvah Shem, that we will see the end to this pandemic soon, that anyone who needs a refuah should have a refuah. And I hope that we could confine our halachic discussions not to those relating to vaccines and diseases, but those relating to genetics and the exciting advances that they entail. So, Rabbi, I'm happy to entertain any questions.
So first of all, thank you. Yasher Koach. Incredible, array of wisdom and knowledge and information about vaccines and genetics. Thank you for the presentation. I know that I have a ton of questions. There are some questions in the chat as well. I encourage all of you, if you have questions, first of all, give us Rabbi, are you good for another 10 minutes or so of
Yeah,
Q&A?
yeah,
Is
I'm
that
actually
okay?
fine. I'm fine. I'm good for a while. I can answer whatever
Perfect.
questions you have.
So let's
Great.
let's maybe call it for about 10 minutes. I just want to give
Great.
everybody that's on it a kind of a time perspective of what's going on.
Sure.
If you have questions, I encourage you to, yeah.
I just want to tell you also, I'm happy to share this. I noticed in the chat room, I'm happy to share the slides. So I'll send those off to you, and you can pass them off to everybody. There's some fascinating material
Beautiful.
which I didn't get to. I did get to. You're welcome to use them. You can cross my name off the front, and feel free to use them.
we would only cite the original. Okay. So, and by the way, I noticed in a few of the slides you cited those other scholars that shared with you some of the sources in clinical literature. So we would have to be consistent with your model. Okay. So a few things. So before I get to actually asking some questions, I encourage all of you to stay on for a few minutes and also write your questions in the chat. I'm going to get to as many as possible. I have my own also. So let's get to some conversations. Okay. So number one, and I think you addressed this, we have a question about Israel. So Israel has vaccinated a large percentage of its population, and yet the cases of COVID are higher than ever. Is it safe to say that it's happening because of one dose of the vaccine as opposed to the second dose, or is there another factor involved?
So there are some unknowns here. One of the major wild cards is the mutation of the virus, and whether the new mutations, which you're all reading about, and there's a few mutations, there's South African mutations, Brazilian mutations, whether these viruses will be covered by the vaccines or not. And whether that's what we're seeing a manifestation of in Israel. I think the answer is that we're just catching up. Vaccines haven't really taken effect yet. They haven't covered enough people with a second vaccine. I think that's more the issue. I think the disease is still rampant. People perhaps are still letting their guard down. And I think once the population, by the way, Israel is literally the light amongst the nations in terms of their rapidity of vaccinating their population. It's really extraordinary. But I think once they vaccinate the lion's share of their population, I think we will see a significant drop in the COVID virus, and it most likely is attributable to the fact that only one vaccine or no vaccines for still the majority of the population have been given. So I'm hopeful that will be the case, and I'm hoping that it seems to be that the mutations are covered by the vaccines, but there's still a little bit unknown on that.
Okay, got it. Okay, do we have a somewhat of a technical question about how the vaccine works, and is there a risk that the vaccine is going to, in some way, set up for autoimmune disease or other types of challenges based on the actual the way that the vaccine works, or as you said, does it break down and just get integrated into the body and it's not causing that sort of thing?
So there were a whole host of fears. I mean, the concept of the vaccine is follows. It's an RNA vaccine, and it really gets the cell to produce just one protein called a spike protein. That protein is the main protein of the COVID virus. The COVID virus has other proteins on its surface, but this spike protein is the protein which gains it entry into your cells and causes it to wreak havoc. So it causes your own cell to produce the spike protein, and then your body will naturally create antibodies to that spike protein. So now your body will be prepared if it gets exposed to the real COVID virus, that it'll already have antibodies to that spike protein and prevent that spike protein from attaching to your cells and entering into your cells.
So I think the question is, if your own cell is developing the spike protein that you're fighting against, are you then fighting against your own cell, and is there a danger in that?
So people who've had COVID virus, for example, aren't having stronger reactions to the vaccine than people who didn't. So they're not having any significant immune reactions. Is there potential concern for people who have autoimmune disorders? Yes, that concern has been voiced. I don't believe there has been any any realization of those concerns. There's still some unknowns, to be sure, but there's no clear reason why it should cause their problems. Having said that, some of the reactions to the COVID virus itself, the harm that the COVID virus caused was from an overreaction of the immune system, which in many people caused the severe lung disease, the storm, the cytokine storm, which many people succumb to, was due to an immunological response caused by the virus itself. So I guess there's a fear that the vaccine might cause the same thing, but to my knowledge, I don't believe it's been borne out yet of any significant concern about that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for clarifying that and for sharing on that. Okay, so question comes up with regard to, somebody in the chat regarding gene editing with CRISPR. I know that you didn't really have a chance to focus on that. I don't believe that you had a chance to focus on that.
Right.
Would you like to mention just something short?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Especially, I apologize. Thank you for reminding, especially because CRISPR was mentioned in the ads. I definitely should mention something about that. So it's another aspect of gene manipulation. So where people are concerned that the vaccine might affect your DNA, CRISPR intentionally manipulates the DNA inside the nucleus of your cell. That's what its objective is. It is an extraordinary technology, game-changing, paradigm-shifting technology. The people who developed this technology just won the Nobel Prize in 2020 for chemistry, which is quite remarkable. Usually it takes many decades before people win Nobel Prize for their work. It's only been 7 years since the CRISPR technology has developed. What this in essence is, it's basically a cut and paste function of the DNA. The DNA is comprised of many letters. So when the letters are out of whack or in a sequence that can cause harm, they will literally, like a typewriter, they'll go in there, or some of your Microsoft Word program, they'll go in there, they'll delete the misspellings, and either the body itself will rectify it, or they'll try and replace it with the proper spelling of the genome, so to speak. So the genes that are supposed to be coded for and the proteins that are supposed to be made will be the correct ones. It is, to my understanding, and I'm not a bench scientist, but from what I've read, it's a relatively simple technology that many people can avail themselves of. It's not something which you have to have $1 billion of equipment in order to use. Scientists across the globe are beginning to use it. Could it help us for treating tay-sachs disease, the breast cancer genes? The potential there is very real and very great. Is there a halachic problem with these technologies? Not intrinsically. No, there isn't. There is no 11th commandment, thou shalt not crisp. There's no prohibition. Could it be a problem if you're doing it on an embryo? That's an interesting ethical dilemma. If you're manipulating an embryo, you're not only affecting just the person who has that disease, you're potentially affecting in perpetuity future generations. So that remains to be seen, how safe that is to do on an embryo. But if it's found to be safe from a medical perspective, and it cures disease, there would be no clear halachic problem to utilizing that CRISPR technology. I think you're muted, Rabbi.
Yeah. No, I was trying to, for some reason, my screen wasn't working, or my mouse wasn't working. Okay, question, when you brought up the case, which was mind-blowing, about the two mothers and about the stem cell and being able to basically, I don't know what the right word is, coax a sperm cell from the stem cell of a woman. So a question that I had is, could the opposite be done? Could theoretically, from a man, from a stem cell taken from a man, could there be an egg that is created?
Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. Same is true. So you could take, one man could produce the egg from a stem cell in their bone marrow, and the other man would produce a natural sperm, and then you could fertilize it. The question is, how would you carry that child? So two possibilities to carry the child. Possibility number one is, and this is not science fiction, by the way, they're uterus transplants have now been done many times across the world. Sweden actually is the pioneer of this technology. The United States is starting to jump on this bandwagon. COVID really slowed things down significantly for these kinds of elective surgeries, especially complicated surgeries. But people are now, in this world that we live in this world which gender is amorphous and a moving target. There is talk of people who change from male to female gender, retaining the right to procreation, which should include their ability to carry a child, and therefore we should offer them and maybe even finance uterus transplants for these people. So would it be possible then for this man to carry a child which is a product of two men? And the other, as I mentioned, that's one possibility, Rabbi. The other possibility is called ectogenesis. Ectogenesis, which has its own, we could do a whole shiur just on ectogenesis, fascinating ramifications, is gestating a fetus entirely ex utero, entirely in the laboratory. So an artificial womb, or artificial amniotic fluid. And this is also not science fiction. You know, there has been a sheep which has been gestated in an artificial womb for a number of weeks, and it's been a successful gestation. We might see in our lifetimes the possibility of a child being gestated entirely outside the womb.
This is fascinating, because I'm thinking, if you have, I mean, I'm just calculating upwards of 4 parties, potentially, maybe even more, but based on what you present tonight, 4 parties potentially involved directly, genetically, because you have two forms, 2 parts of the egg DNA, right? There was mitochondrial, right, plus the sperm, plus theoretically the surrogate, somebody else could be carrying it in the uterus, and maybe even that uterus could be transplanted into someone else. So now we're up to 5, if I'm not mistaken, 5 different individuals.
Right, sounds like a Gemara in Makos. How many Averas can you do with one?
I'm thinking from a Talmudic perspective.
It's funny, from a Talmudic perspective, the Talmud in Maseches Nida says actually that there are shlosha shutfin yesh ba'adam. There are 3 partners in the creation of man. There's the husband, there's the wife, and there's HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and there's God. But you are pointing out very appropriately, Rabbi, that in the 21st century, there are far more potential partners than just those 3. We could go up to upwards of 4, 5, 6, but make sure we always include HaKadosh Baruch Hu as one of those partners, and I think we'll be okay.
As the kids say today, the Talmud says 3 partners, and as the kids would say today, hold my beer, right? You ain't seen nothing yet. You ain't seen nothing yet. All right. The question is there a halachic discussion about, in the case, and this is maybe not all of the cases that we've talked about fertility, but in cases and reproductive technologies, but in cases of infertility. So if at what point does a technology cross over from being permitted to maybe even being obligated? Or does it not go that far?
So great. So one of the extraordinary areas of advance in modern medicine is infertility. There's been exponential development just over the last decade in the world of infertility, freezing sperm, freezing eggs, freezing embryos, manipulations, intracytoplasmic sperm injections, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, amazing things. The question is, what are the parameters, both in terms of obligation and in terms of prohibition? So in terms of the obligation end of it, the consensus seems to be pretty clear that while the Torah obligates us to be fruitful and multiply, and to try in a natural fashion to the best of our capability, there is no clear obligation to utilize assisted reproductive technologies, which are expensive, which require hormonal manipulation, sometimes surgical interventions. So in terms of rising to the level of obligation, it would be a stretch to say that included within the obligation to be fruitful and multiply is the obligation to utilize assisted reproductive technology, although some may come close to that, but most people don't. Question is, what's prohibited? Then the answer to that will depend. There is not a consensus on many of these issues. Some people are more permissive than others. While we generally welcome the opportunity to produce children and encourage be fruitful and multiply, not everybody is a fan of surrogate motherhood, of utilizing someone who's outside the marital union. Not everyone's a fan of using a sperm donor, which could, and there's a debate in halacha whether it's preferable to use a Jewish sperm donor or a non-Jewish sperm donor, just a debate that goes back even to the 1970s. So each technology has to be evaluated on its own merit. I will tell you that there is an extraordinary organization, for those of you who have personal questions or family members that are interested in this issue, called PUAH, P-U-A-H, which is in Israel. And it's an organization that's been around for about 20 years. And the entire organization, which is really extraordinary, is devoted towards every single aspect of infertility in Jewish law, both the medical aspects and the halachic aspects. And they are in touch with literally the world's top infertility specialists and the world's top halachic authorities in terms of navigating this challenging road of infertility.
Do they, just a question for my own information, for my just a curious question, do they also help women and couples with the procedures, or they're just more of an informational?
No, they can be very helpful in terms of guiding you to the right people. There are other organizations. There are organizations called Bonei Olam and A Time, which actually help financially, give financial support, and also give medical guidance. There are a number of organizations here in the United States, and they're not, they don't always interface with each other, and they sort of all have different niches. But there's no question that PUAH can definitely make medical recommendations and guidance.
Yeah, I was familiar with Bonei Olam because I've seen some literature and some videos about what they're doing, and they're also helping finance some of that as well. Okay, question that came up. We'll just do another 2 minutes. You mentioned about potentially being able to do genetic testing and find markers of Jewishness, and maybe that can't be the entire proof, if you will, that one is of Jewish origin, but maybe with a few other maybe circumstantial evidence, maybe that could be what takes it over the edge. The question that was asked: do Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, are there clear genetic markers, or has it not been studied? Are there clear genetic markers or diseases? And I think you mentioned some, certainly tay-sachs. But talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I must qualify. I'm not a geneticist, so my knowledge is not as specific as it could be. There are definitely major differences in the genetics of the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic populations. Generally, the majority of these genetic diseases that we speak about, like tay-sachs disease, cystic fibrosis, familial dysautonomia, Gaucher's disease, most of these are found in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. And it is only, and until recently, it was primarily the Ashkenazi Jewish population that was being tested for in these genetic tests. But there more recently, there is a realization that there are specific diseases which are prevalent within the Sephardi Jewish community. More research has been done on that recently, and there's no question that Sephardim as well as Ashkenazim should approach genetic counselors to address issues premaritally, to see if there are any specific conditions that they should be concerned for. Whereas clearly the majority of diseases are Ashkenazi, there definitely are certain genetic diseases which are found in the Sephardic Jewish community also.
All right, maybe the last question. So if CRISPR could, in the future, at some point, be able to cure genetic diseases like tay-sachs and others, you mentioned cancer before, breast cancer, would using CRISPR on an embryo ever be possibly rise to the level of an obligation, of a chiyuv, because the embryo / child would otherwise not survive or not live that long?
So that is a really excellent question, and it's actually not a science fiction question, because it can be asked in the following way. So while we don't yet have CRISPR, which can be utilized for tay-sachs disease or to remove the breast cancer or alter the breast cancer genes, of which there are more than one or two, what we do have is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So let's say you have a couple that are carriers for a recessive gene for a disease which has a very high percentage of penetrance and is a highly fatal or will cause severe disability in the child. Don't even have to mention the disease, just whatever disease it may be. And they could decide to have children naturally with a high likelihood of having a child with a severe disability, a physical disability that he or she would have for the rest of their lives. Or they could perform pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and virtually guarantee, in the hands of a good laboratory, that they would not have a child with this particular genetic condition. Are they obligated to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis? Now,
right, and just to explain the question for everybody, would it be considered, would it rise to the level of saving a life or protecting life, which would potentially be biblically obligated?
So while there's no consensus on this, there are rabbinic opinions on both sides of the coin. So some argue the following, that we generally are intervening in God's world to some extent, in the whole world of assisted reproduction. So maybe in this area, we should allow nature to take its course, and whatever God wants to happen will happen. Some would argue that point, and we're not necessarily obligated. We can allow ourselves to let nature take its course and put ourselves in the hands of God, if you will. Others argue that you would indeed be obligated to avail yourself of this technology, not only in terms of saving a life, but in terms of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor yourself. If you know the suffering that you could be preventing with this. And by the way, this is not a unique question in the Jewish world. The secular ethics committee is talking about this obligation that a parent would have in this situation as well. But I was actually, I don't have the sources on the tip of my fingers, but there's a few. And by the way, PUA, a number of these rabbis or rabbis affiliated with the organization called PUA have written specifically about this issue, and have suggested that you might indeed, as the question reflects, be obligated in this situation to utilize this technology. So it's not a science fiction question. The question would be directly applicable to a CRISPR scenario as well, but it's already applicable at pre-implantation genetic diagnosis.
Incredible. All right, so there's so much more to talk about. I saw somebody mention in the chat we should do a part 2. So perhaps
I'm up for it.
Okay. If there's enough interest, and if you're up for it, then perhaps we'll check things on our end. But I'll tell you this: as much as we discussed tonight, I think we can all sense, not only sense, but know with every part of our DNA that there's so much more to talk about, and there's so many more issues and more areas to talk about. I see a lot of comments are coming in for part 2s. I'm not going to say if you want a part 2, mention in the chat. That way we'll know for sure. But I also wouldn't mind if you did that. Let's just put it that way. I know I'm like Talmudically speaking about this, but I want to thank you for presenting your wisdom and your knowledge on these topics, and for really opening us up to a lot of considerations that perhaps we weren't thinking about, and a lot of what sounds almost like science fiction, which, as we all know, based on past performance, past technological leap, tells us to not rule out anything, that expect it. And if it's already happening on some level, I'll just say anecdotally, I taught the class about uterine transplantation that I believe that you wrote or were consulted on.
Right.
And I know some of you that are with me tonight took that class with me or with others. And when we taught the class, it was theoretical because no child had yet been born and survived from that scenario. And since it's happened multiple times. So this seems like science fiction. Just give it a few years and it's not science fiction. So in conclusion, for now, I want to say thank you. And I appreciate you sharing. We have more votes for part 2. We'll be in touch. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Yes. Thank you again. And thank you all
My
for
pleasure.
joining.
Great to see you all. And maybe we'll see each other again soon. And be safe. Good luck with the vaccinations, everybody, too. All the very best.
Thank you. Have a good night. Stay safe, everybody. Stay healthy. Take care. We'll see you all soon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Pleasure. We'll see you.